Welcome everyone to session number 5 of the St. Paul's Ministry of Defense. Today we're going to be giving an introduction and defense of the moral argument for God's existence. Last week we covered the argument from contingency, which essentially argued that God is the best explanation for why anything exists at all rather than nothing. Remember, we answered that question by reference to a necessary being, and then upon a conceptual analysis of what a necessary first cause of all contingent things will need to be like, we arrive at a being that possesses a number of the divine attributes, and so come to the existence of God by way of contingent things to a necessary thing. That was a version of the cosmological argument, which again argues from some feature of the world or the universe that renders it needing a cause, and then establishing that cause as what everybody understands to be God. Now today we're going to be looking at the moral argument. The moral argument aims to show that God is the best explanation for objective moral values and duties, that moral values and duties need to find their origin in the divine nature, and God's nature will act as a paradigm for moral values, as we'll see, and an origin of moral obligation. Now, to get into a quick sketch of what the argument will look like, it's going to be a lot simpler than the argument from contingency. It's only two premises and then a conclusion. Premise 1, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, but objective moral values and duties do exist. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. Now, I do think that the argument from contingency and then cosmological arguments in general are more powerful arguments for God's existence. That is to say, I think they're more robust. I think they would be more successful with the toughest atheist or the toughest skeptic. But the moral argument actually tends to be more effective in evangelism and in apologetical contexts because, one, it's more accessible, right? It's not as cerebral or abstract as the cosmological arguments. But then building on that, because they're less heady, they relate more to the human experience. They're more concrete and grounded. And the reason why is because, as William Lane Craig points out, you can ignore philosophical arguments or scientific evidence for the finitude of the past, for the beginning of the universe, or you could ignore metaphysical considerations about why contingent things need causes, or you can brush all that off as high philosophy, as speculation, as something that's not really impacting my life. But what you can't ignore is the question of morality, right? Nobody can really ignore good and evil, or right or wrong. It turns out that every day when you get up, you answer by how you treat other people. Are other people ends to be respected and valued for themselves, or are they just mere means to be used for your own selfish ends? And so this question is unavoidable, the existence of good and evil, because we're confronted with moral questions every single day of our lives. And to be moral is, in a big sense, to be human. And so while you can ignore a lot of the philosophy and science that undergirds the cosmological and design-based arguments that we'll look at next time, you can't ignore what it means to be human. You can't ignore good and evil. So while I think this isn't as strong as an argument that we can give, I do think that would be the contingency argument. It's the most effective argument. It changes the most minds while being plenty strong in its own right, as I hope you'll all see today. So first, let's break down a couple of key concepts. So first, we'll distinguish objectivity from subjectivity. So to say that something is objective is to say that its value is independent of what any person thinks about it. For instance, gold's atomic mass, right? That's not dependent upon what any person thinks, right? So in objective cases, right, when we're talking about something objective, the truth value concerns the object, not the subject. So I'm a subject, let's say a debating partner of mine is another subject, and let's say we're arguing about the mass of Mars. It's not really going to matter, right, anything on our ends, anything with a subject. The mass of Mars, right, the truth of what that's going to be, all we need to do is look at the object, Mars, to determine that. So that's going to be to say that something's objective. Now, something is subjective if it is dependent on what humans think. So, for example, the tastiness of certain fruits over others, right? If somebody thinks that bananas taste better than strawberries, let's say I think that, and the person sitting across from me thinks the opposite, that strawberries are better than bananas. Well, to gauge the truth of that statement, bananas are better than strawberries, we're going to have to look at the subject, whether me or that other person, to determine the truth value. The truth value is not going to lie in the object itself, the bananas and the strawberries, because there's nothing in them that dictates objective taste. That's on the end of the receiver by definition, on the subject. So subjective truths are going to depend on human opinion, while objective truths are not. Now, secondly, we'll distinguish moral values from moral duties. So moral values concern the values of good and evil. So for example, good would be things like love, generosity, self-sacrifice, kindness, forgiveness, and then evils would be, of course, hate, selfishness, greed, deceit, wrath, right? Everything like that. Moral duties, on the other hand, concern right and wrong. So for example, what would be right would be to love your neighbor as you love yourself. And what would be wrong would be stealing, right? Or what would be wrong would be treating people of different races differently from one another. So it's important to understand that there's a difference between good and evil and right and wrong. And lots of religious authorities often confuse this. You'll hear a lot of people say that the point of life is to do good. But I want to try to argue that the point of life is actually to do what's right, and that there is a difference between good and right. They aren't synonymous with each other. Think about that, right? That first question there, just thinking about the good. If the principle of life was to do good, then how would you ever decide what to do? Because presumably there are a number of different goods on offer to you at many different times. So for example, deciding what to do with your life. You know, being a doctor and then treating sick patients and taking care of them and bringing them back to a state of health is a good. That's a supreme good. But so is fighting fire, right, and rescuing people from burning buildings. That's also a good. Well, you can't do both of those at the same time. You're either going to be a fireman or you're going to be a doctor or something else. It doesn't seem like you can do both of those full time simultaneously. And so if your principle of life was just to do good, then you wouldn't actually know what to do in that situation because they're both good. Similarly, if your principle was to avoid evil, well, oftentimes you're caught between a rock and a hard place, and it seems like, you're going to have to do an evil no matter what. If your principle is avoid evil, then you'd have to not act, but then that could be even worse, right? So we need to ask ourselves, right, what are we actually pursuing? What's good or what's right? What's right concerns obligation, what you ought to do. And so that seems to be the real principle here, right? Is not do what's good, because lots of things are good and they're incompatible with one another oftentimes. The principle is to do as you ought, is to do your duty. And that's what the sense of moral duty is. It's going to be obligation, what you ought to do, what you should do, what you must do. That's going to be moral duty, and that's going to be the principle of life, is to do right, not necessarily good. And even think about this in the context of the priesthood, right? So lots of people, especially lots of young Catholic men, discern priesthood and marriage. While both of those are wonderful goods, right? Being married, right? Engaging in one of the sacraments and engaging in a union that reflects the relationship between Christ and his church, right? It's hard to think of too many things greater than that. Yet the priesthood is to be a servant of the Lord directly and to be a gateway for God's grace to enter into the world in a unique way, right? And so that's also a supreme good, right? Reconciling sinners to God in the confessional. All of those are wonderful goods. Both of these options are. But you can't do both at the same time, right? At least not in the Western church. So the question is, what's right? And then you follow what's right. And in that case, what's right would be what God is calling you to do. although the analogy isn't perfect because we think with vocations in that sense, it's an invitation, not an obligation. And so it doesn't hold perfectly, but you get the idea, right? What you should do versus simply what's good. And that's going to be important moving forward because moral values are going to be different from moral duties. Now let's look at that first premise again. It states that objective moral values and duties cannot exist without God. And I give at least 5 reasons and motivation for that premise. So first, if God does not exist, if atheism is true, then 1, human beings have no value, reality is fundamentally material, morality is a product of natural selection, values are subjective and arbitrary, and there is no one instituting duties. Let's address each of these in turn. So let's think about the value of human beings on atheism. So if you remember from our talk 3 weeks ago, we talked about the fundamental questions of life. Origin, right? Where do we come from? Identity, who are we? Meaning, what's the purpose of our lives? What's the reason for our existence? Morality, what's right and wrong? How should we conduct ourselves? And then destiny, where are we going when we die, if anywhere? These are the big questions of life. And if you remember, the answer to them on atheism, they're all depressing and they're all dark, right? Our origin is that where we were coughed up by a combination of random processes that had no intention to them. There was no mind-like structure guiding them towards a final end. We're just cosmic accidents. A whole lot had to go right for us to be here today. We're here by accident. There's no purpose. In terms of identity, we are just electrochemical machines. We're just slightly advanced primates. We're just ultimately 80-kilogram arrangements of atoms. Meaning, I argue that there is no purpose or meaning to our lives on this view. There's certainly nobody ascribing them to that. And also, there's no action or sacrifice or endeavor that we could engage in that would make any ultimate difference. To say that something is ultimately meaningful is to say that it ultimately makes a difference. But if mankind, both individually and collectively, is doomed to perish in a relatively short amount of time, then it doesn't seem like there's any impact that we can have on the universe or anything lasting. There's nothing lasting that we can create. And so it seems that our lives really have no meaning. Like a light flickering randomly in infinite darkness preceding it, it flickers for a brief second, goes out of existence again, and then infinite blackness on the other end of that. Again, it doesn't really matter if that flicker ever existed. That doesn't seem to be meaningful in any way. Morality, that's going to be the subject of the talk today. And then destiny, right? Destiny, we're just consigned to oblivion, both individually and collectively as a species. So all this comes together to essentially support the idea that human beings have no value on atheism. Where's the value in a life like this when that's our origin, our identity, our meaning, and destiny, right? Where is there any room for value in that scenario? It doesn't seem like we should be more valuable than any other animal, or why animals should be valued over non-life, right? Any criteria you assign is going to seem to be arbitrary. So in this picture of reality of us tucked away in this distant corner of the cosmos, it just really doesn't seem like we have any value, right, apart from God and this atheistic framework. What about the nature of reality, right? What is reality ultimately like without God? Well, without God, if naturalism, materialism specifically is true, the idea that all that exists is nature or the material world, then reality itself is fundamentally just particles in motion. All that exists are matter and energy. And so how can we talk about the purpose of life, right, with something like this, right? All that exists is matter and energy. It doesn't seem like if that is what reality is fundamentally, particles in motion, just matter in motion, it doesn't seem that we can really have the language of good or evil at all, right? How can you say that one arrangement of matter or one state of energy is good and a slightly different one is evil, or that one is right and another one is wrong? How can you import those moral terms in a world fundamentally governed by science, which is how the world would look like in a materialistic reality? It doesn't seem that we can use that language. That language seems borrowed from another universe in a world that looks like this. The philosopher David Hume was famous for his "it is ought" fallacy. You can't look at the world as it is and say it ought to be something else, right? Because science only tells you what is the case. It doesn't tell you what ought to be the case. So if there was a man who is in the process of stabbing another man and is driving the heart through one of his organs, science will be purely descriptive. It'll tell you what's happening there. It'll tell you what part of the organ is being punctured, how much blood is being depleted from the body, what that's doing to the brain, what that's doing to the oxygen levels. It'll describe everything that's happening, on a material level. But it isn't. There's nothing in the sciences that's going to tell you that that shouldn't be happening, that that person should not be driving the knife into the other person. There's nothing in science that's going to tell you that, because that's just out of the domain. But yet, that's what reality is ultimately going to be governed by, purely by science in a materialistic world. And so it doesn't seem that we can use the language of good or evil when we're talking about a reality that's just particles in motion. It just doesn't seem like there's any room for moral language. Now let's look at the origin of moral values themselves on atheism. So let's look at how the philosopher of scientists Michael Ruse describes the origin of morality on the atheistic picture. He writes, "The position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, 'Love thy neighbor as thyself,' they think they are referring to something above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory." What about the famous evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, right? The great new atheist. How does he describe it on the atheistic framework? He writes, "There is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being." So, if moral values and duties are not grounded in the divine nature, and if the world is fundamentally material, which that's not the only option available to the atheist, but that is the majority opinion of atheists, and that all that exists is the natural world, and we'll get into the response to those atheists who would look for a moral foundation in something outside of the universe later on. But just assuming materialism, assuming naturalism here, this is where moral values come from. They come from the evolutionary process. They're an aid to survival. And we even see instances of primitive altruism in our evolutionary precursors and in other species, right? You see examples of a herd morality, of even sacrifice in certain instances, right, for the good of the group, because there's a survival value to that. There's a benefit, right? The species overall is better in many cases if everyone isn't completely selfish. So it would make sense that we have these inclinations and that we come to value different things. And that's just coming from the biological framework. You add sociology as well. It's pretty easy to see that certain behaviors, not being conducive to the flourishing of society, become taboo over time. So it seems that the ontological genesis, the origin of moral values, is highly dubious on atheism, because an entirely different set of morality could have evolved, right? Just looking at the trajectory of biological evolution, it could have gone in so many different ways, right? It could have gone millions or billions of other ways, but yet it went precisely this way. And if you rewound the film of evolutionary history and shot it anew, we could have come to a very different set of moral values. And who's to say that those other values would be false? That the ones that we have are the correct ones. There's nobody that's dictating that, or there's no moral law that's going to be a reference point for gauging which moral values are the correct ones. And so if this is the origin of moral values, it's hard to say that they're objective when they could have been different, and they could have been radically different. Remember that to say that something is objective is to say that it's binding. It's independent of what human beings think. But if we think of these things because of the process, because of evolution, and that could have gone differently, then how are we to trust that they're actually the right ones? There's just no reason to think that they would be the right ones. And especially if that's what their origin is, right? It's not just our awareness of the moral law, it's also the origin of it. It seems like that process could have spit out a whole different set of moral values, and that casts severe doubt on the prospect of them being objective. And so the position of the secular evolutionary biologist would be that moral values are ultimately just illusions. They're just necessary features for a flourishing society. I also think that without God, moral values are arbitrary and subjective. So without God, everything becomes relative to times, first of all. So the paradigmatic issue that has evolved over time is slavery. So in the ancient world, as is well known, slavery was the norm. It was practiced all over the world, even in Africa, right? It's not an advent of the white man, for instance. So in Africa, wealth was expressed in terms of persons, of owning persons, and in Europe, wealth was expressed in terms of owning land. So people have owned other human beings and have abused them throughout history all over the world. And the severity of slavery as an institution, of course, varies around the world. But certainly none of it is ideal, right? Especially how we conceive of it in terms of owning another human being. So that's what we think today, though. That's not what was thought back then. Even Aristotle gives rational arguments for why slavery is a good institution. So it seems that moral values differ across time. And without God, without an objective anchor point or reference point, then it seems that morality is just going to be a product of whatever culture we live in, at least on certain major issues. And can we really say that 400 years from now that society is going to think the exact same things about morality that it thinks now? That's highly doubtful, right? And so without an objective reference point in the divine nature, then how are we to say that the values of our time are superior or inferior or more or less correct to the values of another time, whether they be in the past or the future? How do we gauge that, right? What is the objective reference point without God? You know, people from those times would have their reasons for their views. We have our reasons for ours, and presumably people in the future will have reasons for theirs. How do we distinguish who's right and who's wrong? Even using the language of moral progress, right? Lots of people will say that in many areas we've made moral progress over time. But by what reference are you saying that, right? What are you referring to gauge that one is more or less correct than others, right? There has to be an objective standard that you're saying one set is closer to. But what is that objective standard without God? It just seems that morality is going to be relevant to the times, just as it seems like it's going to be relevant to the cultures, right? Certain practices that we would find abhorrent in the West have been practiced in the East, and they find certain things that we do abhorrent as well. So the Indian practice of sati coming from Hinduism, widows are burnt alive at the funerals of the husbands in certain circumstances. That's considered morally repugnant here in the West. But yet, that's something that has been practiced on the Indian subcontinent. In China, at different times, there has been a practice where little girls, when they're babies, their legs would be tied together, their feet would be tied together to resemble lotus bottoms. And this would cause disability and harm for the rest of their lives. That's something, again, that we are repulsed by in the West. But yet this was something that was done in China. I had an ethics professor last semester who used to be very progressive and so was a moral relativist, right? He thought that morality was irrelevant and was relative to different cultures. So what's right for Americans may not be right for somebody in an African tribal culture. So that's what he thinks when he's younger. And then he goes on a group trip. It's a volunteer trip. They go somewhere in Africa, and when they get there, they give a talk to the American tourists. And they have all the men sit in chairs in the front few rows, and they have the women all sit on the floor in the back. And they say, this is what we believe here. This is what we do. There's a male superiority. And from that day on, that professor stopped believing in cultural relativism. It does seem that that tribe did something objectively wrong by treating the women as second-class citizens. It seems that men and women have equal value. And yet, if there is no God, if there is no objective moral standard, then who's to say that the values practiced and cherished in one culture are better than those in a different culture? You may really like your values more, but they really like their values more. There's no way to decide without an objective reference point in God. It's just culture against culture. And then, of course, you don't even need to look at that macro level. You can look at the micro level with the individual. Not even all individuals in the same culture are going to agree on morality. The funniest example of this would be the example of the new atheists, right? So that would be Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Daniel Dennett. Two of them English, two of them American. And both, all are vicious atheists, all in war, and all hated Christianity. And they did something really funny. A number of them came up with their own 10 Commandments, in criticism of the biblical 10 Commandments, and their sets of commandments disagreed with one another, right? So it's really funny, right? Without an objective reference point, things boil down ultimately to the individual level. And let's say that one person really values one moral truth, and somebody else disagrees with that and says they've got it dead wrong. Ultimately, if you're going to say that person is wrong, if they responded with, says who, that's it, right? What are you going to say? This isn't something you can study scientifically. You can use philosophical thought experiments, but those are meant to track truth. They're not meant to come up with truth. But in this world, it doesn't seem like there's any way of distinguishing good and evil beyond the individual level. What if that person said, what's right for you may not be what's right for me, right? How do you respond to that without an objective reference point to say, no, I am closer to this than you are? It seems like without God, everything just boils down to the individual level. But yet, do people actually live like that? That's what we'll see when we look at premise 2 of the argument. But to summarize, it just seems that without God, everything becomes relative to times, cultures, and individuals. And that's not absolute at all. There is no objectivity there in relativity. Either something's objective or it's relative. It's dependent on the subject, not the object. And yet that's what the story seems to be on atheism. Now let's consider moral duties. So you remember, those are obligations. Moral duties concern right and wrong, not good and evil. That's the realm of moral values. So let's think about this, right? Fundamentally, without God, human beings are just slightly advanced primates. That's what we are. We contain extreme genetic similarity to our closest ancestors and to other primates like chimpanzees. We're just fundamentally animals on the atheistic framework. If we don't have a soul, and if we aren't made in the image of God, we're just animals. But animals don't have obligations towards one another. When an animal, let's say a bird, when a bird goes and kills a fish, it kills the fish. It doesn't murder it. When the bird takes a fish from a different bird who gets distracted by something, it takes it, but it doesn't steal it. When a great white shark forcibly copulates with another great white shark, it forcibly copulates. It doesn't rape it. So we don't use moral terminology with animals. Because again, right, that moral terminology implies an ought, right? Even in the language of steal, right? Why do we use steal and not take? Why do we use murder and not kill? Why do we use rape and not forcibly copulate? Because they contain a notion of wrongness, of injustice. They contain with them the implicit notion that this should not have happened, that this person should not have done that, right? Rape, murder, theft, those are all universally considered to be bad things by definition, virtually. But yet we don't use that with the animal kingdom because there isn't a sense of should with them. There's just the sense of is, what they're doing. It's ultimately just nature. But on the atheistic framework, human beings are just part of nature. That's all we are. We're just animals. And so there's no reason to think that we'd have obligations towards other animals. It's just animals living and acting according to their very desires. That's what animals do. And yeah, we're rational, we're intelligent. So all that means is that we have more sophisticated desires. It still doesn't mean that we should act in a certain way. What's imposing obligation on the species of animals called Homo sapiens, right? Why should we think that we ought to do certain things? Now, we saw 4 reasons why we should think that good and evil don't exist in a world without God, but let's just assume that they did. I definitely don't think that you could get to an account of moral values without God, because you could get to moral obligations without God, moral duties, because on analysis, obligations are instituted by competent authorities. That's the origin of moral obligations, or of any obligations in general. So, for example, getting pulled over. When you get pulled over, you have an obligation to stop and to comply with the officer. Why? Because he's a competent authority. When a bishop wants to move a priest out of an assignment he's enjoying, he has that obligation to listen. Why? Because the bishop is his authority. So it seems that obligations arise from authorities, and they're issued and instituted. They don't exist in the air. Let's assume that good and evil do exist without God. Who's to say that I should pursue the good? Right? Who's to say that I should do the good thing? Where do we get the language of rightness or the language of wrongness? Who's to say that I shouldn't do this? Right? Imagine a world where there's no God, and then I'm walking down State Street and I hear a woman screaming and some men telling her to be quiet. Who's to say that I should go and help them, such that it would be right to go and help them, and it would be wrong if I kept walking and minded my own business, even if it didn't do anything? Who's to say that it would be wrong to do that? There isn't something just floating in the air that's saying I must do this or I must not do that. So the nature of obligation seems to preclude the possibility that there isn't any authority instituting them. It seems that if you want obligation or you want duty, you're going to need a competent authority to impose them. But of course, without God, who is the competent authority that would be able to institute moral obligations that are binding for all persons at all times? It seems that no person is going to be subject to that, or is going to at least have the power to do that. And if they would have the power to institute that, then they would also have the power to break it or institute the opposite obligations. But of course, we perceive these moral duties and obligations to be necessary. It seems necessary that we shouldn't murder, or that it would be right to help those in need as best as we're able. These seem to be necessary. They don't seem to be any different. So that account without God is going to be deficient. There's no reason to think that I ought to do anything without a competent authority issuing the command or the obligation to do those things, even if they're good. So now we saw 5 reasons, right, why we should think that objective moral values and duties do not exist and cannot exist without God. And we largely arrived at that conclusion by looking at naturalism, right? By looking at the idea that all that exists is nature, so nothing exists that's supernatural, right? Materialism, right? All that exists is the material. There's nothing beyond that or above that. But some atheists might say there is actually a supernatural foundation of morality, so we're not going to be materialists, we're going to reject naturalism, but we are going to reject God as well. So we're still going to be atheists or agnostics. But we're going to ground morality in a foundation that's not in the natural world. I agree you can't get it just based on nature, just based on science, but maybe you can get it from something that's supernatural that isn't God. And so this is a view that's called moral Platonism. And so moral Platonists argue that moral values like love, justice, and loyalty just exist necessarily as abstract entities. So love is just a part of reality, and then other things participate as that, and participate in that, and those serve as instantiations of love or justice or loyalty. So this is the view of moral Platonism, right? These things are not existing as part of the natural world, but they are existing as abstract entities in reality. Same way that plausibly numbers exist. So just as the number 2 exists, love, justice, and loyalty would exist. In whatever sense numbers exist, these moral values exist as well. Now, the problem is that this is a very odd view, right? Especially if you say that they exist apart from God. Because what do you even make of the claim that love and justice and loyalty and fairness just exist on their own? It doesn't seem like even a comprehensible claim. It seems that moral values necessarily exist as properties of persons. Does it even make sense that loyalty exists if there are no persons? Who is there to be loyal? And who is there to be loyal to? It's hard to conceive of loyalty just existing on its own. It seems like it's always going to be instantiated in persons. Same with love. And even on many definitions of love, love is to will the good of the other, or to give of oneself to someone else. But if there are no ones there are no someones, there are no people, then it's hard to see how love can even exist, even in principle, right? Abstract or not, it seems that it's required to be a property of persons. So it doesn't seem that, moral values just exist when human beings have only existed for a relatively short period of time in the story of reality, and then will go out of existence. That doesn't really square well with the idea of moral values as necessary truths. But again, it just doesn't seem like they can even exist in the first place if there are any persons. And clearly, there haven't been any persons for the majority of the history of the universe and of reality. Also, even if these moral values do exist as abstract entities of reality, like numbers, it's so surprising that we would have evolved to track them and to trace them, right? As we saw, the evolutionary picture and story could have gone so many different ways, and we could have evolved an entirely different set of moral values. It would be a fantastic coincidence if we evolved with the set of moral values that does actually track reality, that tracks the correct moral values. What are the chances of that on atheism with an unguided process like evolution? What are the chances that we grasp the correct moral values, that we hit it just right? It's almost incalculably low. And so we have good reasons to doubt this account. But I think the dagger in the heart of moral Platonism, especially of the godless sort, would be that this view doesn't and can't make sense of moral obligations, the idea of ought, right? Because again, even if the good exists, there's no reason to think that we should pursue it, that we're doing something wrong to not pursue it. Because again, obligations are instituted by persons. And if there is no authority figure, if there is no person like God, then ultimately nothing is right or wrong. But yet that's part of our intuition, something's right or wrong. So moral Platonism can't be the answer here. Even if it could ground moral values, which I don't think it can, and we've seen good reasons why we should regard it as being unable to do so, it is definitely not able to make sense of moral obligations. You'll hear from a lot of people that ethical systems form the basis of morality. So maybe Aristotle's virtue ethics, or Kant's deontological ethics, or consequentialist ethics. So consequentialism is the idea that right and wrong is constituted by the consequences of those actions. So the most popular form of consequentialism is, of course, utilitarianism, which advocates for the greatest happiness principle. So an action would be right if it maximizes the overall level of happiness. So you might think, oh, there we go. Or maybe with Aristotle and virtue ethics, virtue is going to be the mean between two excesses, and so that's going to constitute the good, and that's going to constitute the right as well. And Kant is, of course, a whole course, right, with the categorical imperative and the 5 formulations of that as forming the basis of morality and moral obligation especially. But the key thing to understand with these ethical systems is that they're systems of applied ethics, right? So applied ethics is different from the foundations of morality, right? So there's the existence of morality, and then there's morality applied. Those are 2 different domains of study. All of these theories in these systems, they presume that the good exists, right? So, for example, for the consequentialist, for the utilitarian, they are assuming that happiness is the good. And they would make arguments for that, but then they've gone past applied ethics, right? They've got into the existence of moral values themselves. And so these systems are not going to form the basis of morality, and they're not even intending to do so. They're assuming that there already is, that good and evil and right and wrong exist, and then they're trying to figure out what actually constitutes right and wrong and good and evil. But they already presume that they exist. So ethical systems are not going to actually form the basis of morality. The most popular objection to premise 1 that you'll hear is the Euthyphro dilemma. You'll learn this in any philosophy or ethics class that you take, and you'll see it all over the internet as well, which is sad because it's largely been handled over and over again by Christian philosophers, especially in the last half century. So the Euthyphro dilemma is essentially an objection to God being the foundation of moral values and duties. And here's how it goes. So according to the dilemma, the first horn is about why God wills something. So we can ask the question, okay, does God will or command something because it is good? Or is something good purely because God wills it? If 1, then goodness doesn't depend on God, right? God is conforming to some external standard. But if 2, then the good seems arbitrary. If all that makes something good is that God commanded it, well, presumably God, could have commanded something else. So that would make the good arbitrary. But again, our intuition of the good is that it's necessary. And so either way, God is not the foundation of moral values and duties in a meaningful way. Either he's conforming to something external, or morality is just the whim of however he's feeling. Either way, we don't have a satisfactory account of God as the foundation of moral values and duties. Now, the response to the Euthyphro dilemma is to argue that it's false. So dilemma is false if it posits 2 non-mutually exhaustive options. If those are not the only 2 options. If there's an alternative, then the dilemma is false. And it does seem like there is an alternative, namely, that God is goodness itself. So it's not the case that God commands something because it is good, and so is conforming to an external standard, nor is it the case that something is good merely because God commands it. Neither one. That's not what the good is. God is goodness itself. So God's nature acts as the paradigm of moral goodness. So God's nature is definitive of goodness. And what this means, basically, is that something is only good insofar as it is like God. So to say that something is good is to say that it resembles God. And great philosophers have given examples of how paradigms work in secular contexts. So for example, the length of a meter back in the day was not determined by an abstract length called a meter. The length of the meter was determined by a meter bar that was housed in the Bureau of Weights and Measures in Paris. And so that meter bar acted as the paradigm of a meter. And so something was only a meter. You could only say that something was a meter if it corresponded to the meter bar in Paris. And how much it missed the mark would determine how close it was to being a meter. And so we would see something similar with morality, right? God's perfect and holy nature serves as the paradigm of moral goodness and serves as the definition of goodness itself. So something's only good if it matches up to that meter bar of the divine nature. And so God's commands, so moral values are going to be grounded in the divine nature, and God's commands are going to be reflections of that perfect nature. And so it's not going to be arbitrary because God is morally perfect, but also it's not going to be external because it's ultimately going to be based on God. Everyone is going to agree that a foundation or explanatory stopping point of morality is needed. If we're going to be more realists and we're going to think that there is objective morality, then we are going to agree that, okay, that comes from somewhere. There does need to be a foundation or a source. And so we can ask ourselves, why think that that foundation is God? Well, we've already seen that without God they can't exist, right? But saying more, God is defined by St. Anselm as that which none greater can be conceived. God is the greatest conceivable being. If you could form a conception of a being that was great and mighty, but there was a conception that was greater than that thing would be God. There is nothing greater than God that the intellect could imagine, that could exist in reality, in principle. And so that would entail perfection. Because if a being is imperfect in any way, you could conceive of a being greater, namely one that has no imperfections, it's perfect. So God is going to be a perfect being, and so therefore he's going to have a perfect nature. And so a perfect nature would house moral values and duties, right? It would be definitive of moral value, right? It would be greater to have a nature that is exemplary of moral value than one that conforms to an external standard. And so the perfect nature provides us with a non-arbitrary foundation of objective good and evil. The divine nature is eternal and serves as an anchor point for morality that can keep morality steady and secure across the changing tides of cultures and times and individuals. No matter what any time thinks, no matter what any culture thinks, no matter what any individual thinks, good and evil, right and wrong are objective because they're grounded in the eternal anchor point of God's nature. And moral obligations, right and wrong, are constituted by the lawgiver. The moral law requires a moral law giver. And so you have a perfect foundation that exemplifies the moral values of love, of goodness, of faithfulness, and everything else. And you have a lawgiver to institute both the positive commands, to love your neighbor as you love yourself, and the negative commands to not pray for any evil to befall any enemy, for instance. So now let's turn to premise 2. If you remember, premise 2 states that, in fact, objective moral values and duties do exist. They really do exist. So to say that murder, to go out and murder a little child would be as wrong as saying that 2 + 2 = 5, is to say that they're both on the objective level. They're both dealing with truth that's independent of what any human being thinks about them. So let's motivate that premise, that they really do exist. So why do we think that objective moral values and duties exist? Because we perceive them through our moral senses. In the same way that we can answer the question of why we think that there's an external world of physical objects around us. Lots of people who study philosophy are what's called skeptics. For whatever reason, they are unsure that we are actually perceiving a world of material existing objects around us. Either we're a brain in a vat who is that's being fed all these perceptions and sensations, but they're not actually there, or maybe we're in a dream, or maybe we're in the Matrix, or maybe there's an evil demon, right? That's probably an outdated one nowadays. But for whatever reason, they're skeptical of the external world. They're skeptical of the existence of a world around us, and that the world that we're seeing is the actual world around us, right, more precisely. But yet, why do we actually, most of us, believe in the objectivity and the validity of the external world? Because we perceive it with our 5 senses. That's ultimately the only reason why we think that it exists around us. There's no other reason. It boils down to that. So just as we think that there's a world of physical objects around us, and that the world that's presented to us is the real one because of our senses, so we believe in the objective moral world through our moral senses, right? I really sense with everything in me that if I were to get angry and go outside and then run over a group of kids getting onto a school bus, that I would have done something objectively evil and objectively wrong. There's no justification for saying that would be right. Everything in me is telling me that that's wrong. I perceive that in such a powerful and strong way. And so, in the absence of a defeater, then one is right to trust his senses, right? Maybe skepticism is the right view. Maybe the external world around us is false. But in the absence of any reason to think that, we should go with our senses. They seem to be right. And so in the absence of any reason to doubt them, we should go with what seems to be the case. We should trust our senses. And just as we trust our natural 5 senses, we should trust our moral senses of an objective moral world around us. And that's another thing too. We don't just sense that this thing would be wrong for me to do. We sense that it is wrong in itself. And as we saw before, that cries out for a foundation. Now, somebody might object and say that the evolutionary origin precludes the objectivity of moral values, right? So we saw from looking at premise 1 that the evolutionary process could have gone so many different ways and could have spit out a whole different set of moral values. And so doesn't that cast doubt on the objectivity of them if we could have gone a whole different set? I'm going to say no. That would cast doubt on the objectivity of them given atheism, but not given theism. Why? Because on atheism, the evolutionary process would be the origin of objective moral values. But on theism, the evolutionary process would not be the origin of them. The origin would be the perfect and holy nature of God. And even if we came to have an awareness of those moral truths through the evolutionary process, that doesn't mean that those values are therefore wrong, that there is no truth there. That would just be the way that God has communicated them to us through the evolutionary process and then through conscience. So, and then you might ask, okay, well, how can we be sure that we tracked the right ones? Well, presumably, right, if God is going to be the author of creation, he would still ultimately know how the evolutionary process would work out, right? Especially on the Augustinian view of creation, which is that God creates the universe with innate and latent potencies that would unfold over time according to his plan. So we are ultimately the way that God intended us to be. So we can have good reason to think that our faculties and intuitions do track the moral truth, at least broadly. And then the special revelation in the scriptures would refine that and make it more accurate, especially with the authority of the Holy Catholic Church and its magisterial authority. And so there's no reason to think that the evolutionary process poses an objection to objective morality on a theistic picture, even if they do on an atheistic one. And also, when people do try to object to the second premise, and they try to argue that moral values and duties are not actually objective, but subjective, 99% of the time, they don't actually believe that. They're just paying lip service to relativism. But they've been taught relativism on the one hand, but yet they also believe in their hearts and intellectually as well that relativism is false, that there are some moral absolutes. They think that it's objectively true, for instance, that a culture that is tolerant and fair and that takes care of the marginalized is objectively better than a culture that is intolerant and unfair and neglects or takes advantage of the marginalized. They're going to be absolute and unequivocal on that. And so when you're dealing with somebody who is unsure whether or not good and evil and right and wrong are objectively real, or if you yourself are unsure, I'd encourage you to bring up some examples to tease your moral intuitions. I found that the most effective examples in our culture are those of race and those of rape. So with race, right, we have had a very sad history of racism in our country, and so rightly so, we have a heightened sensitivity to racial issues. And so ask somebody who doesn't believe in the objectivity of moral values and duties if they really think that it's not objectively better to be non-racist than to be racist, or if it's objectively wrong to treat somebody worse because he's of a different race. 99% of the time, they're not going to hold to that anymore. And especially with women, right? You can ask, would it be objectively wrong for a man to go out and corner a woman who came out of a mall and rape her in the back of his car? It's a sensitive issue, and it's uncomfortable. But think about what the detractor is saying. The detractor is saying that that's not something that's objectively wrong, that heinous act. But they don't actually believe that, though, 99% of the time. And so by bringing out that example and by forcing them to be a little uncomfortable, they'll come to see that it is objectively wrong, that action. And you aren't bringing that out to win a debate or to beat up on them or show them how much more rational you are than them. You're bringing it out because fundamentally you want them to be a complete person. And that's not a complete person who's saying that that action is not objectively wrong, to say that that could be right for certain people, or that there's nothing about that that makes it wrong independent of what anybody thinks. That's an incomplete person. That isn't being human in the full sense to recognize clear good and evil and right and wrong. And so you're actually helping them, in addition to revealing the rationality and reasonability of God as the best explanation of lots of the data around them. And so you're helping them in several ways. So again, I can't overemphasize the importance of using examples to illustrate right and wrong and good and evil. Because again, this is why the moral argument is more powerful than the contingency and all of the cerebral arguments. Because you can't avoid these questions. They're not abstract, they're concrete, and they matter and they affect us. And so use examples and help people become fuller persons in the true sense of the word, which is to confront evil and to do what's right and avoid the wrong. And so, to look at the argument again, in all of its glory, premise 1, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. But they do exist, and so therefore, God exists. Now, the question you need to ask yourself with this argument, and with all the rest indeed, is not that, are you certain in any of these premises? We're certain about very few things in life. The question we ought to be asking, rather, is whether or not these premises are more plausibly true than their denials. I may not be 100% confident or certain that objective moral values and duties actually exist, but is it more plausible that they exist than not exist? Same thing with the first premise. And if the answer is the affirmative to both of those, then you ought to believe them as true. You ought to accept them. And if you accept the premises, then you ought to accept the conclusion that God exists. And so that's the moral argument, that God is the best explanation for the objective moral values and duties that we all experience every single day. So thank you very much, and we'll see you all next week with the argument from the applicability of mathematics.